you all for being here today. We understand that change is difficult and can generate confusion and frustration. As we navigate the implementation of the NAR settlement together, we remain steadfast in our commitment to serve and support you. We will continue to offer programming and resources like today's session to empower you and your success and to help you better serve buyers and sellers in our current environment. I'm a firm believer that adversity and challenges always bring opportunities, and we are here to help you withstand the challenges and embrace the opportunity. At the end of our program, we will share additional information on our resources, services, and information that are designed to facilitate the practice changes. As a reminder, we cannot offer you legal advice. You should always check with your own legal counsel if you have a legal issue. This session is being recorded, and we will make it available as soon as possible after the program. And we will also be sending an email with resources. And now I am excited to introduce our speaker. For those who don't know Brian Schneider, he is a leading expert, trusted business advisor, and litigator. He serves as general counsel to trade associations, foundations, MLSs, including regional MLSs, and technology firms, counseling them on antitrust compliance, governance, membership contracts, trademark strategy, employment matters, and risk management. His experience and accomplishments are too long to list, but I know you will gain great insight and perspective from his presentation. So please welcome Brian Schneider.
Thanks, Linda. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for tuning in, and I hope this is a helpful session for you. As Linda mentioned, I worked with a lot of MLSs, a lot of realtor associations, so I'll try to give you perspective of sort of what's going on around the country and how it affects your local market as well. I think it's important to start off with some context of why are we here? What brought us to where we are today to have to face all the change that we all now are facing in this industry? And I think broadly, we have to look back that basically for 5 or 6 years, plaintiffs, consumer groups, and the Justice Department have been attacking this industry aggressively, broadly, and to some degree effectively. They have changed the dialogue in many ways in their favor to tell their story, which not all of us certainly agree with. But their story is that sellers and buyers didn't understand how the money worked for brokerage services, that buyers were not able to control their destiny, so to speak. Sellers were being overcharged. And ultimately, the basic idea of blanket offers of compensation from a broker to a broker was causing a price-fixing conspiracy. And, as we saw, that resulted in a terrible jury verdict in October of last year. Imagine that, it was just October of last year. And that then spawned 26 plus class actions around the country. And I and my firm were representing defendants in those cases. And it's important to recognize that there were hundreds of brokers sued in those cases, many of which had fewer than 10 or 20 agents. And so they were looking at bankruptcy from the mere fact of becoming a defendant. Just the ability to pay the legal fees was going to force them out of business. And ultimately, looking at this constellation of threats, this nationwide classes, local classes, state and metro area classes, the industry was under an incredible legal cloud. And as we saw, plaintiffs won. They won their trial. They got billions in damages just in one case. The attorneys were going to get their bills paid to the tune of tens of millions of dollars, and they were looking for more people to sue. That constellation, as I said, sort of brought NAR, I think, to the strategic decision to find a way to protect the industry and get the industry out from under that cloud. They might have been able to appeal successfully, but that's a gamble too. And so what they did is they got what I have called a pretty remarkable settlement deal that closes out that cloud, that gets rid of the litigation for almost the entire industry. And that includes all realtor associations, but most importantly, all realtors, for no money on behalf of the realtors. The realtors don't have to pay anything to be part of the release, to be part of the settlement, and therefore not themselves get sued. Thousands of brokers and their firms are released without having to pay into the settlement, without themselves being sued. That's a huge success, frankly, in a class action settlement. But on the flip side, the result is that we all have to now shift how the industry works with our clients, what our contracts say, and how the compensation process works. That's the trade-off for having that legal protection. So what does it mean? Well, as of this week, and in your market just a few days ago, last week, the new rules go into effect. This is NAR's settlement timeline. It's available on their website at facts.realtor. And I'm highlighting here really the 2 points that I think are most important for all of you. Again, it's the rules changes this week, and we'll go into what those rule changes are. And then after Thanksgiving is the hearing before the court. And the court, the judge who oversaw the jury trial, who understands the case very well, will decide on November 26th whether to finally approve the settlement deal. It's already been preliminarily approved, which in most cases, the vast majority of cases, means it will be finally approved. And this judge, we fully expect to approve it, given his support for the deal. So as we look ahead, and nationwide, all MLSs essentially are going to be making these changes starting on August 17th. Your market started a little earlier because your technology vendor called for it. Ultimately, there's 2 big changes. There's no offers of compensation anywhere in the MLS. And I'll go into it a little bit more, but as a general matter, I will say, don't try to play games with this. The MLS has to have a zero tolerance policy. 2, new forms. So for buyer and seller clients, there are disclosures that need to be included in all of your contracts that say that the commission amount is not set by law and that it's negotiable. And then, of course, the arrangement will, in most cases, also change, where the seller is agreeing to pay the listing broker. The buyer is agreeing as to what amount the buyer broker may earn. And then there will be a negotiation between the 2 sides of whether or not the seller will or won't cover some or all of what the buyer broker may earn. And that will show up in the purchase agreements. So you'll have new forms. This great association has created helpful forms as well. And so I encourage you to take a look at those and really familiarize yourself with how those work. Before we get into the MLS pieces, it's critical to be familiar with the 5 rules that you all have to comply with as realtors. So part of the settlement agreement, as I said, gives you protection from being sued. It releases you from the damages from the past and says that through this summer, you are clear. You can't be sued for the antitrust claims that have been going on in the industry. That's a big deal. But in order to have that protection, you have to comply with these 5 rules. And this isn't just an MLS rule. This is the part of the settlement. So if you don't comply with these 5 rules, someone could then sue you under the antitrust theories that have been successful against other brokers. So it's really important to have these 5 on your list. That you've got to have a buyer agreement signed before your first showing or tour that includes the amount that the broker may receive from any source. Now, there's lots of nuance there. Every broker can decide what that contract looks like, how much you want to charge, whether you want to charge the buyer. There's lots of options, but you've got to have it in writing with your buyer client. If the seller is making an offer of comp, if you're making an offer of compensation to the other side, the seller has to approve it in writing first before you do it. You have to disclose that commissions are not set by law and are negotiable. As I mentioned, those are in the new forms. You cannot represent that your services are free or available at no cost unless there is no financial compensation from any source. So if you're going to take someone on a tour and you won't earn anything from that arrangement, even if the person buys the house, for example. This is sort of a pro bono effort to introduce a new client. You absolutely can do that, but you have to explain that to the client in writing, how that will work, that you will earn nothing. Lastly, and this is important as well, you have to provide your clients with all of the information about the homes that they have told you are within the parameters they've set. And it can't be based on any amount that's offered from the other side to pay the buyer broker. So if you've got 12 properties that are showing up that look interesting to your client, and only one is offering a blanket offer of compensation, you still must show all 12. You still must share all 12 pieces of property with your client, but of course explain to your client, here's what's going on with these 12. Here's what the one that is making an offer of compensation is making, and here's how it would work for the other 11 if we wanted to negotiate it in the purchase agreement. And then you work with your client to figure out how to proceed. And lastly, it's important to note that in order to be included in the settlement agreement, you actually must be a realtor. You must be a member of the association by August 17th of this year. If you're not, you may not be included in that settlement and release. So let me give you a sense of kind of how I think about the changes in the system. So if we think about what I'm calling the old way, which was only just last week, of how realtors and MLSs sort of interact to get brokers paid, right? So you're familiar with it, right? The seller has a contract, they agree how much they're going to pay their broker. Buyer side, some had a contract, some don't. Sometimes it was disclosed how that broker would get paid on the buyer side. The seller would then put in the MLS, here's the information about the property, and here's how much the buyer broker will get paid if they are a successful buyer broker. And then at closing, on the Alta and in the closing document, 99% of the time, the seller is paying the seller broker and the seller is paying the buyer broker out of the proceeds of the home. And the buyer simply pays the seller for the home. So how do those things change? So if you look at the orange area, there's a lot of change. And this is what I think is scary. If someone told me tomorrow that a court just ordered that lawyers can't bill by the hour, I know that I would be thinking about how do I entirely restructure my business model. So I understand that it's stressful for all of you as well. And so I'm trying my best here to try to help think through how this might look. So now, under the new arrangement, the buyer is going to negotiate with their broker how much the broker may earn. And that is up to the broker of how much they're willing to negotiate or not accept. On the selling side, at MLS listing entry, the listing broker will put the information about the property in the system, but not any offer of compensation. Not in the compensation fields, which are now gone, not in the remarks, not in a photo. I heard someone the other day saying they were going to do a TikTok video where they danced out a percentage number. Can't do it. Please don't play games with it, because the MLS is bound by a court order once the settlement is approved. And it puts everyone at risk of additional antitrust claims. I think for the next few months, once you get past MLS entry and you're doing showings or you're dealing with broker-to-broker conversations, this is where it's going to be hardest, I think, for many, is thinking through as a buyer broker, how do I find out if the other side is willing to offer to compensate me or to cover my client's costs that they've agreed I can earn? And I think for a while, there's going to be this process of text messaging or asking at the showing or calling the agent and saying, is your seller willing to cover? And that's perfectly permissible. Those texts or calls, what have you, you absolutely can have that conversation to ask, is your seller willing to cover the costs of the buyer broker? I think in many markets, though, what the seller's broker is going to say is, put it in your purchase offer. The seller is absolutely willing to consider any elements in the purchase offer, including covering buyer broker costs. Tell us how much you need and put it in the purchase offer. And then once you have the purchase offer, then the seller will negotiate and agree of how much concession they're going to provide to cover various costs at closing. And then, of course, at closing, the seller is still going to pay the selling broker, And if they agree, they're going to pay the buyer's broker as well based on purchase offer negotiations. And if the seller refuses to accept and is able to negotiate not covering all of the buyer broker's fees, then it's up to the buyer's broker and their contract with their buyer of whether there's anything left over and how much the buyer is going to be on the hook for. That's, again, up to you and your client to negotiate and work through as you discuss the value of your services with your client. So let's shift now to some frequently asked questions. And of course, please, feel free to submit questions as you'd like, and we'll definitely make time for that as well. So, can I offer broker-to-broker compensation? Can I offer compensation like I used to? The settlement agreement absolutely allows it, as long as it is not through the MLS or systems that use the MLS. So, think like Showing Time, which is a system that relies on data from the MLS. You can't make offers of compensation through Showing Time or documents that are uploaded through Showing Time. You can't make offers, through a portal website where they're taking in data from the MLS and you're sharing offers of compensation there either. But you can absolutely do it elsewhere. Put it on your yard sign, put it on a billboard, put it on your business card, put it on the flyer that you hand out at the open house. If you want to make an offer of compensation, you absolutely can. But there's a couple caveats that, as a lawyer, I think through and I'm concerned about. In particular, if you're using a website or some sort of forum where multiple brokers are sharing compensation information about how much they're willing to offer, then you're really just recreating the same system that the plaintiff's attorneys just convinced the jury to award a $5 billion judgment on. And so, I am concerned that as these websites pop up to share compensation information, they're just going to get sued, and so are all the brokers who are using them. And what I've seen so far is that as those websites have popped up, many of them have been shut down once they realized that there would be that antitrust risk. And I think brokers are telling them that when they see it. The second is, as you think about this new market dynamic, why would a seller want to authorize you in writing, because any offer of compensation has to be made in writing, it has to be authorized by the seller in writing. Why would the seller want to make a blanket offer of compensation when the buyer and the buyer's broker on the other side might have agreed to some other low-cost arrangement? They get that purchase agreement and the buyer is saying, well, my buyer broker only, needs X. You've offered Y, which is higher than X. Why would a seller want to make that blanket offer? And so I think you have to think about how you're going to advise your seller clients about why to make that blanket offer when in fact the other side might have agreed to a lower amount. I think the same point or similar point is, how will you respond when other agents are telling sellers they don't have to make an offer and they should expect to be asked to cover the buyer's costs in the purchase agreement? If some brokers are telling selling clients that and you're not, how do you explain to your client why that other arrangement that another broker was telling them about, why is your arrangement better? And I think that's part of what you're going to have to explain. Whereas I think 2 weeks ago, because it was the norm to offer a split, you maybe didn't have to explain it that much. Now you'll have to explain it. And then lastly, if it's not in the MLS, how will you make that offer of compensation binding? If you're the buyer broker and you go to the showing and the selling broker says, oh yeah, no problem, we're offering X%, that's not a binding deal. That's an oral statement that you're never going to hold someone to. So do you have a contract that says you're going to get paid that amount? That's where I think ultimately a lot of focus is going to be on the purchase agreement, because the purchase agreement is a binding contract for the seller to pay the amount towards the buyer broker, and that's going to be binding at closing. What if the seller or seller's broker offers more than what the buyer agreed the buyer's broker could earn? So under that scenario I was just talking about, what happens then? So the seller has agreed to make a blanket offer of X%, but the buyer broker agreed with their buyer to only charge $5. Well, now in order to accept that amount, the buyer broker is going to have to go back to their buyer client and agree to amend their contract to be able to accept that additional amount. And if I'm a buyer, I'm going to say, well, you agreed to accept X. The other side's now offering some larger amount. Why should you get the money? I'll take it as a rebate or a concession, or maybe we'll split it, but now this is another negotiation. Do you really want that as a buyer broker? You're going to have to think that through. Can I use a sliding scale with a buyer? So the answer is sort of yes. You absolutely can agree on any rate structure you want. So if you want to charge a fixed amount per showing and then a fixed amount or percentage to close a deal, great. If you want to charge a percentage for the whole arrangement, great. If you are interested in, sort of doing a trial run with a client and, taking them on a couple showings and take them to lunch and get to know them, and that's sort of how you market your services, get a contract with that client that says, I'm not going to earn anything for this intro period from any source, no matter what happens. This is a get to know you period. And then once you're ready to hire me, then we'll get an exclusive arrangement and we'll agree on how much I can earn. That's cool too. Any of those arrangements are fine as long as you've got it in writing with your buyer client. There's been an example that I've been thrown out, and I realize each market's different, that in some markets, new construction are a big deal, and that the builders are offering varying amounts of buyer rep payments and incentives for the buyer reps to show their clients these homes. And the answer to that is, yeah, you can accept that buyer rep payment, but you got to have that disclosed in writing and agreed by your buyer client that you can accept it. How about Fannie, Freddie, FHA, VA? Are there any restrictions there? Well, the good news is that the VA updated their rules. And so now they're all essentially the same set of rules, which is a buyer still can't finance what they pay to a buyer broker. And that's a real challenge in this new framework, and we recognize that. And it's something that I think a lot of folks are going to focus on, because if you can't get the buyer broker fee financed, then you're probably going to need the other side to cover it, or you're not going to be able to afford the home. And that's the arrangement that you're going to have to explain to your clients. The good news, though, is that all of these entities now do allow the amount paid to the buyer broker to be included in the loan if the seller pays it. So as you think about the financial arrangements, there's a real incentive in the arrangement, just like there always has been, for the seller to commonly pay the other side's broker at the closing and cover those costs. Can you include concessions in the listing? So absolutely. Just like always, concessions have been used in the MLS for years, usually in the remarks field. You absolutely can say where the seller is willing to offer a $5,000 credit, a $100,000 credit. Absolutely, that is that, and then it's negotiable. Some MLSs are choosing to add or enhance those concession fields. Some are not. I think this is going to be a trial period for whether listing concession fields become something that folks like to use and that it adds clarity or not. And there's debate about it. So it'll depend on sort of how your market ends up using it and what information becomes helpful in the listing. The key, though, is that if there's concessions in the MLS, including in the remarks field, it can't be limited to paying the cooperating buyer or broker. So you can't say, we'll pay concession towards the buyer broker or something similar to that, because then it's just an offer of compensation. It's the same thing. What does the settlement mean for dual agency? Well, at a simple level, it doesn't change dual agency at all. Those arrangements are covered by state law, and the settlement has no role overriding state law or talking about dual agency. But again, as sort of the lawyer, I wonder how you're all going to navigate negotiating the compensation piece for both sides if you're handling both sides of the deal. And I think that's something worth thinking through within your brokerage and with your own attorneys. How do you handle that situation to negotiate that compensation piece in a dual agency situation? So those are the FAQs that we put together, and I can see there's some questions in the chat, and I encourage you to keep those coming. I'll pause there. Why don't we shift to those?
Great. I'll just start with a few questions, Brian. The first is attorneys are telling us that compensation from seller to broker cannot be included enforced in the purchase agreement because we're not a party to that contract. Can you address that?
Yeah, so there's a lot of legal ways to solve that. If there is no mention of the obligation to pay the buyer broker in the purchase agreement, and the buyer broker is not a party to it, that could be a legal problem. There are two pathways, though, to solve for that. One is to update the purchase agreements so that it does cover that concept, so that the buyer broker is able to enforce that duty to pay. The second, and this is where I would encourage you to talk with your friends who are in the title business. What I've been told, at least in the markets that I work with brokers in, is that the title company will not close if the purchase agreement called for a payment to the buyer broker, and then at closing, the seller refuses to make that payment. So the title company should manage that as well.
Great, thank you. Our next question is, how will you be able to show an electronic lead customer a property prior to signing a representation agreement? Can that be discussed at the first face-to-face meeting? Does an unrepresented buyer need to sign something saying they will not sign a broker rep agreement?
I think those are two questions. So let me address the first one first, at least as I'm thinking about it. So the first question, if you get an electronic lead, you've never met this person, you're emailing with them to set up a showing or, to go meet them out at a house. The answer is, if you can have them sign your contract electronically, great. That can be very easy. If you want to, meet them outside and chat with them and say, look, before we go in, I gotta, make sure that I'm covered legally, I'm required to have you sign this. That's another way to do it. And I think it's about messaging. I think, preparing your scripts for how you're explaining this contract to people, and also what the contract says. Is the contract client friendly? Is it binding them to pay something that you're never gonna be comfortable with? I think you got to think through what those contracts actually do. But that would be the arrangements that I've seen people discuss about for electronic leads. And the second question, does an unrepresented buyer need to sign something saying they will not sign a broker rep agreement? I'm going to read that to mean if you're the listing broker and an unrepresented buyer comes to the house during like an open house or something, do they need to sign something? So I'm not sure that that's what the question was asking, but I think that is. And in that event, so NAR has issued on their website, I think now over 100 answers to frequently asked questions. And so definitely encourage you to read through some of those. One of them, though, is on point here, which does confirm what I thought, which is that as a listing broker representing the seller, an unrepresented buyer who comes to your open house, you are not representing them. And so you do not need to sign a contract with them because they're not your client.
Thank you. Okay, then we have another question regarding buyer agent compensation. The question is, how is it shown in the ERS agreement, and can it be added under additional remarks?
So nothing about compensation can go in the remarks because that is prohibited by the settlement agreement. So NAR's agreement is no offers of compensation, nothing about compensation can be in the MLS, full stop. I apologize. I'm not exactly sure what the ARS agreement is. Maybe I should know that.
ERS, excuse me.
Exclusive right. Oh, the exclusive right to sell. The exclusive right to sell agreement. Yes. So this depends on what form you choose to use. I think that this association's, Hudson Gateway's forms are, I think, quite good in that regard. And I would encourage you to take a look at them for how they set up the compensation arrangement.
Thank you. Then another question is, must I have a signed buyer compensation agreement with a buyer who is a customer and I am the listing agent?
Yes. So that would get to sort of a situation of sort of dual agency, right? You're representing both the listing agent and the buyer client, in which case you need to satisfy the disclosures for dual agency and have that agreement with the buyer client.
Thank you. Will we be able to show offers of buyer compensation on our own company website?
Yes, you can show offers of compensation on your own website, including, by the way, if your website is also a searchable site for properties. As long as you're showing your offers of compensation for the listings you have, and you're not gathering and collecting other brokers' offers of compensation on that site, you're perfectly fine to advertise your client's willingness to make offers of compensation.
Thank you. Companies are using the concession field as a replacement for the buyer's compensation. Isn't this contrary to what the settlement was trying to accomplish?
Yes.
Thank you. Buyer agreements that I've seen mention a retainer. Can you explain in some detail how that works?
So I'm sort of reading between the lines of that question. What I have seen in some models, some brokers will choose to say, all right, you'll pay me a fixed dollar amount for my work, X dollars. And I may also earn Y dollars if we close the deal. So, I think that's what you're referring to as a retainer. And yes, that is permissible. The settlement agreement nor the MLS rules are going to get in the way of how you negotiate what your clients will pay or how much you may earn in the deal.
Thank you. How do we deal with buyers not willing to sign the buyer broker agreement since it makes them responsible for compensation as opposed to working directly with the seller broker?
Yeah, so I think that's one of the toughest questions. I'll be candid. It's an awkward first step, right? You're trying to make nice with this new person who you maybe just met or never met before, and trying to create a relationship with them. And the first thing you do is shove a contract in their face. And while I'm a lawyer and I like contracts, I don't like doing that either. And that's hard. And so I think, again, sort of thinking through your messaging is important. The reality is, if a client refuses to sign it, I think you need to talk to your brokers and talk to your brokerage lawyer about how to handle that situation. I can't give you a good advice on how to deal with that and be compliant. Certainly, you can't play games with the requirement by saying, well, none of my clients sign that, right? I can tell you that. But I think you need to talk with your broker and your own lawyer to deal with what may be hopefully the rare situation where someone refuses to sign anything. The one point I will say, though, and this is important, is that the settlement agreement does not say that buyer agreement has to require the buyer to make any payment. And that's an important distinction that I think a lot of people are getting hung up on. Is your agreement with under the settlement agreement, your agreement with your buyer client has to agree how much you may earn from any source. Does not say how much the buyer specifically has to pay. Now, of course, if you have a contract that's saying how much you may earn, your buyer's going to want to know, well, am I on the hook for that? And so you're going to need to cover that in the document. But you don't have to, right off the bat, tell your client, oh, by the way, you're going to pay me X%. Nice to meet you. There's ways to navigate that by setting up a contract that works for you and your business model.
Thank you. What measures should be used to track fair housing? If there isn't a direct offer of compensation or seller says, bring me an offer, how can we distinguish if one buyer pool is not paying more due to protected classes?
I completely agree with the thrust of that question. It's one of my biggest concerns about the settlement agreement is that it will be much easier to explicitly or implicitly discriminate on how much someone's willing to cover the other side and how the communications go. I think you're right. And candidly, at the moment, I don't know a good answer to that of how the association or the MLS can systematically try to take measures to avoid it, other than enforcement of the codes of ethics, which prohibit that by a broker, obviously the state licensing boards.
Thank you. This question is just asking for some clarification. She writes, am I understanding correctly that Brian said a broker's website should not disclose compensations offered by sellers because broker is subjecting themselves to antitrust lawsuits?
Right. So I apologize if it was not clear, and I may not have been. You absolutely can advertise on your website how much your clients have authorized to offer on your listings with your clients. That is perfectly fine. What runs the risk of antitrust claims is sharing on your site or sharing through some third-party site all the different broker offers that are going on in your market. So basically, trying to recreate essentially the offer of compensation in the MLS through another website. That's where the antitrust risk arrives. But if you're just advertising on your site, hey, here's our 100 listings that we're managing, and here's the offer of compensation that's being offered on those listings, perfectly permissible.
Thank you. This question says, can I put in my payment agreement that whatever is offered by any other party will be deducted from my fee?
Absolutely. And so as long as the amount that you can earn is specific, you can say in the agreement, you buyer will only pay anything that I can't recover from the other side. Absolutely. The key though is your buyer agreement can't simply say, I will only get paid whatever we can get from the other side, right? It's that whatever that is too vague to comply with the settlement agreement. You've got to agree to a specific number.
Thank you. Can the seller concession be used to pay can be used to pay buyers broker commissions?
Yeah, so I mean, conceptually, right, a seller concession is a pool of money that the seller says, I will give you a credit back towards whatever you need at closing. And so if the seller says, look, I'm willing to give, $5,000 credit, it's up to the buyer how they want to allocate that, including to the buyer broker's commission.
Thank you. How do we handle having a buyer customer, or can we?
Oh, I think you're making a distinction between customer and client. And I think is what that question's trying to get at. And the answer is nothing has changed in that regard. So to the extent, state law, and I am not an expert in New York state brokerage law, so please don't hold me to it. But to the extent state law allows you to have a distinction between customer and client, you may continue to do so. The difference, though, of course, is that either way, you've got to have a document that lays out how much you will earn for the work you're doing.
Thank you. Can a buyer roll broker compensation into a conventional mortgage? Won't that be subject to interest and inflate the number?
Right. So most conventional mortgages, commercial mortgages, FHA or Fannie Freddie backed mortgages, you can't finance the buyer broker fee that the buyer paid. So if the buyer pays it, you're not going to be able to roll that into the mortgage. However, if the seller pays it, if the seller agrees to cover it, that is able to be rolled into the mortgage.
Thank you. How will MLSs or boards be able to intervene in commission disputes, if at all?
Right. So I think the easiest example is when there's a dispute over procuring costs. So if a buyer client has two contracts with brokers, and both brokers are saying, well, I earned the commission on this from that buyer, that's a dispute that a board could adjudicate.
Thank you. If a landlord wants the tenant to pay both the landlord's agent and the tenant's agent a fee, how do we disclose that?
So the question said another way is kind of, does the settlement agreement's rules apply the same way to landlord to rentals? And the answer is yes. The rules apply the same way. So landlord can absolutely offer to cover anything they want on the other side, but you can't make an offer in the MLS to pay the tenant's broker. You can agree in the lease. You can communicate a concession. Hey, tenant, I'm giving a $500 credit to any new tenant, and the tenant then can use it however they want. And maybe the lease says that that some portion of that amount goes to the buyer broker or to the tenant's broker. All of those things are arranged, but you can't make an offer specifically for the tenant's broker in the MLS.
Thank you. Unrepresented customer agency form that you work for the seller. Do you need an agreement or just the state disclosure for representation?
So without going into state disclosure, and if anyone on the line knows better about the state disclosure, I'll defer to you, because again, I'm not an expert in New York agency law, unfortunately. As much fun as it sounds like it might be. The answer under the settlement agreement, and for purposes of Hudson Gateway and of One Key MLS, if you're representing the seller, you do not need to have anything with the unrepresented buyer about, well, you don't have to have anything. If there's a disclosure under state law, that's a different story.
Thank you. This question is asking for some clarification. I was under the impression that a BA can't be amended. So can an agent put $1 compensation and amend when putting an offer in after finding out what the comp actually is?
So a buyer's agreement definitely can be amended just like any other contract. The question is whether your buyer is willing to amend it, right? Because both parties have to sign an amendment. And the concern I have is if you come back to your buyer client and say, oh, I was just kidding. I didn't really mean that that's all I'd earn. Your buyer client now is able to negotiate. Well, I want some of that credit back to me, not all to you. So that's kind of the wrinkle that I could see playing out.
And another follow-up from the same person, is a BA required for rentals and dual agency?
Yeah. So, the litigation and the Justice Department's work has been entirely about residential sales. And so all of the sort of the implications of the cases are really just about sales. However, the rules do apply as a protective matter to avoid additional litigation, and the settlement agreement are being read by NAR to apply to rentals as well. And so the same requirements around not making offers of compensation in the MLS and contracts do apply to rentals.
Thank you. Again, just clarifying. So we need a paper to be signed in order to show any property. Just want to make sure I fully understand.
To show a property with a customer as opposed to showing your own client's property, yes.
Thank you. Do current listings need to be put on a new agreement?
Yes.
Can we display that in the agent remarks without putting in a commission fee? I'm not sure which.
I'm assuming that is offer of compensation, and no, you can't put that in the agent remarks.
Thank you. Can an automated lead generation system send out listings before we even speak with a lead to discuss the buyer agreement?
I think so. So if what you're saying is you've got like an automated email system that once a lead comes in, they automatically get some communication about an agreement. Happy to show you the house. Sign here to accept our terms. Here's the amount I'll get paid. Yeah, you could do that automatically. Sure, if you've got the capability.
Thank you. What about if a buyer signed a form with another agent and then signs a form with me and I show them a home? Do we have to list the address that we are showing on the form?
Yeah. So No, you don't have to list the address on the form. You could, if you wanted, make it a single property agreement where, I'm going to show you this one property. If you buy this property, I'll get paid. If you buy something else, I won't. That's certainly an arrangement you can negotiate. The problem you just identified, though, is slightly different. If a buyer signs two contracts, both of which are exclusive representation contracts, and then buys a house that was, that is covered by both of those contracts, then you've got a dispute as to who exactly earned the commission, and that's the problem with that arrangement. And it's going to be a dispute that the buyer is going to have to deal with.
Thank you. So this is asking for some more clarification. We can have a buyer customer. So did you just say that we cannot request compensation for working with a customer?
No, I didn't say that. So you can request any compensation you want from a customer or a client as long as it's in writing in a document agreed to by that customer or client.
Thank you. And I think you've addressed this, but just for some more clarification, if a buyer comes to the listing agent and wants to see a house, not an open house, do you need to have a form signed? And if so, which one?
So if the listing agent is not representing the unrepresented buyer, no. But if the listing agent is becoming a dual agent, yes.
Thank you. If the broker owns all the listings, not the specific agent, any of the agents in the brokerage can show the property to customers unrepresented. Wouldn't an agent be able to show the property with the agency rep form, not AER agreement? Should New York create a new form similar to Connecticut called unrepresented? That might be more clear as to how that buyer.
I don't know. Yeah, that's an interesting question. I'm not familiar with the Connecticut form, and I don't know what your legal obligations would be if your agents are showing people homes, and whether or not that would still be considered representing them. In most states, it would. I don't know New York law well enough to tell you if that causes a problem.
Thank you. Can your offer of cooperation to a buyer's agent vary from company to company?
As long as your selling client authorizes that in writing.
If an unrepresented buyer purchases a home and there is incorrect information in the listing, where does the liability fall?
That's a little different from the compensation questions. That gets to the sort of the truthfulness of something about information in a listing. So I'm going to pass on that.
Thank you. Are there NAR or HDAR approved lease agreements available for landlord agents to use?
I will turn that back to you all, Liz and Linda. I don't know if you have, I know you've got some rental agreements. Do you have that one?
We do have lease agreements.
Great.
And you can find those in the member portal on the HDAR website. NISAR form has what the BA comp is. The HDAR form does not. Isn't that a conflict? For example, can't the listing agent share more with agents she knows over an agent she doesn't using the HDAR form where BA is not disclosed?
I'm not sure I see the specific example you just laid out, and I don't really see it as a conflict, but I do see it as different views of how agents and brokers should be using the new compensation models. And look, I think the next, as I sort of started off, I think the next 3 to 6 months is going to be a challenge for everyone about how this ends up working. And I think a lot of listing brokers for now are going to try to maintain whatever offer of comp they were making. They're going to, try to get their clients to authorize them to keep making those offers of comp. And so I wouldn't be surprised to see that happen. However, I think once new listings arise and a seller client is properly advised about the best strategy to get the most money in their pocket, I don't see why a seller client would be asked nor authorize a blanket offer of compensation or even a specific offer of compensation to specific firms. I think in a rational market, in that situation, the seller is going to say to every buyer that asks, put your request in the purchase agreement. And the seller's then going to look at the various purchase agreements offers they get, and negotiate from there. And if it's 1, they'll negotiate with that. And if it's 10, then they'll negotiate among those. But I think, I don't see why a seller would make a blanket offer of compensation, knowing that the other side may well and maybe likely has agreed to some other number.
Thank you. If purchase memos have been issued in the last 10 days and contracts haven't yet been fully executed, do we need new paperwork due to the August 17th deadline?
Yeah, so the trick is, does that paperwork that you have so far cover your compensation as the buyer's broker? Does it say how much you're going to get paid? And if it doesn't, do you have a copy of the listing that had the compensation information in it, so you can show that this is what was offered before the system turned over last week?
Thank you. Does the listing agent have to disclose the buyer compensation by the seller if asked?
Not sure I followed that. Does the listing agent have to disclose the buyer compensation
By the
by
seller
the
if
seller?
asked.
Oh, if asked. So that depends on what they've agreed to with their seller client. So, you should be agreeing with your seller client whether you can disclose and how much you can disclose. So, I've seen contracts where the seller client is agreeing, yes, you can communicate to the other side that I'm willing to cover some or all of their compensation, or I'm willing to cover up to X% for buyer broker conversation. You can communicate that to the other side. And then alternatively, no, you can't communicate anything. I want to see it in the purchase offer. Those are all options that I think a listing broker now can work through with their client in a way that I think ultimately shows more value for both sides of the agents to negotiate.
Thank you. If a certain dollar compensation is agreed upon, which is based on the listing price, and the property sells for above the original asking, how does this work? Is it recommended to just use percentages instead of dollar amounts because of this?
Well, I think the key is, what does your agreement say? Is it based on the list price or the sales price?
Okay. As the listing agent, are you allowed to negotiate compensation with the seller for a deal with an unrepresented buyer?
Yes, I've seen forms that say that if someone's unrepresented, then I'll get paid, X dollars more because it's more work for me to close the deal.
Thank you. And this is just asking for some clarification. In the instance your buyer agreement is earning you less than the seller was willing to offer, you mentioned amending the contract, but could we not just add language to our buyer broker agreements that basically says agent works for X or Y if Y is equal to a higher amount than X? This way you're covered pretty much for all deals.
You'd have to make sure that it's very clear how that calculation happens. And so, just in the context of a short, question on Zoom, it's hard for me to see what that contract would actually say. The key is that, can someone look at that contract and objectively see, here's how much you'd earn? If the answer is, well, it's up to X depending on what we get from the other side, that doesn't fly.
Okay. Looks like we just have a few minutes left, so I'm going to try to get through a few more questions.
Okay.
Who determines the amount that would be paid to the buyer's agent? Would it be the seller, the listing agent, or both?
The amount that gets paid to the buyer's agent is what you negotiate as a buyer's broker with your buyer client. And then from there, you determine how much you can negotiate for the other side to cover.
Thank you. Does the listing agent have the right to ask for a copy of the buyer agency agreement?
They can ask for anything they want. They have no obligation to share it.
Okay. I think we'll make this our final question.
Sure.
Please verify once more about placing the compensation arrangement on the purchase offer or memo of agreement. The question is, should we add a place on these forms so it's transparent? Can we have this form the seller buyer signs, as long as we note that this is not a contract and just an acknowledgement?
Well, so ordinarily the purchase agreement is a contract. If it's an informal offer to work out terms in a term sheet, then that's not a contract. But, I would want to see a purchase agreement where you're laying out the terms, including the line item of how much the seller is going to pay for, each of the following type of costs for the buyer, whether it's buyer broker fees or repairs or finance, buy downs, things like that. You would ordinarily want that in the purchase agreement. If you're talking about an unenforceable agreement that, there's no deposit, there's no arrangement, I'm not sure how you hold them to anything. But ultimately, I think the key is it binding? Is it binding against the seller to pay the credits? Is it binding against the buyer to buy the house? Subject to any contingencies, and is it binding for the buyer broker to be able to say, I'm going to get paid? And a properly structured purchase agreement should look like that.
Great, thank you. I think that's all we have time for now in order to keep within our Zoom call. I believe we're going to post this presentation on our website. And then Linda and Brian, I'll let you say some closing remarks.
Fantastic.
So thank you so much, Brian, for being with us today. I know we couldn't get to all of the questions, but I think everything you answered and presented, I think, offered a lot of clarity and did help, I think, dissuade some of the doubts. We will, as I said, we will continue to provide resources and programming, and our next webinar with our legal counsel, Brian Levine, will be on August 20th, and you can register on our website through the calendar or in the member portal. Our website continues to be updated, and we do have that landing page for questions about the NAR settlement, and we will continue to update that. Our new forms were launched last week on August 8th, and we know there were some errors, and we will continue to work through the forms as NYSAR is also working through their forms and possibly making changes, but they have been updated and are available in the member portal. They will not be available in Instanet immediately because of the backlog with all of the associations launching new forms, but we will make an announcement once those are available. And we do have our member success team trained to answer your questions, but again, encourage you and remind you to seek your own legal counsel for legal matters and updates. And you can also go to facts.realtor, NAR's direct site, and that is the site that Brian mentioned has the FAQ that is updated, and those are dated so you can see if there's new questions that are being answered. Would you like to add anything else, Brian?
No, thanks for your time. It's always great to get really creative, interesting questions. Thank you all for doing it. I hope it was helpful, and best of luck. I know this is a lot of change, and I feel for all of you as you navigate this, but I think this is going to be okay.
Well, we thank you, and I agree with you. I think we're going to be okay, but I understand everyone's frustration, and so we will continue to work with you. Thank you, everyone. Have a great afternoon.
Thank you.